So biology, the study of life. A lot of you guys will have studied it in middle school or high school. And we're just gonna jump right into the content. So the first thing that you want to know in this very accelerated crash course of biology are the 4 macromolecules. So macro means big. These are big molecules. And what kind of big molecules are they? They're these 4 types: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates, you might have heard carbs before in your food. They're made up of these kind of like, you can think sugars a lot of the time. Sugars are carbohydrates. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And if you put them all together, these macromolecules are like, you have these small units, monomers, and you put them all together to form something called a polymer. Monomer means one. It's like 1 unit. Polymer means like many units. So you take this 1 unit of monosaccharide, which is the monomer of a carbohydrate, you put them all together and you get a polymer for the carbohydrate. And one example is if you take glucose, a sugar, and you put a bunch of glucose together, you get starch, which has a lot of carbohydrate energy. And an example of where you'd find carbohydrates are in chloroplasts. So when plants are making sugars, they would make starch. And the second example here is lipids. So lipids, as you can see here, you just have a lot of carbons and hydrogens mainly. There are some oxygens as well. You get a lot of carbons, hydrogens. They're very energy rich. You can put them together to form fat. That's what you normally think of when you think of lipid. It's just like fat. You can also think of like oil. Oils are lipids as well. Proteins are the 3rd form of macromolecule. So proteins are made up of these things called amino acids. And when you put a bunch of amino acids, and when you put a bunch of amino acids together, they're like usually 20 types of main amino acids we talk about. You put them together, you form something called a polypeptide. So again, poly means many. So you have a few of these amino acids, you put them together to form a polypeptide. And then you can fold these polypeptides, and if they have like a special shape, you call it a protein. And so proteins are used throughout the cell for all sorts of functions. Like almost literally any function you can think of, proteins are there. And the last one is nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are formed of these things called nucleotides. And again, if you stick a bunch of nucleotides together, you form, usually you can form a nucleic acid like DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA, ribonucleic acid. And when you have all these DNA strands, for example, together, and you bunch them all up in the cell, they can turn it into chromosomes, which you might have seen before. You might know that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So again, 4 macromolecules. You have carbohydrates, which are made up of monosaccharides. Lipids, they're made up of fatty acids. Proteins, they're made up of amino acids. Nucleic acids, they're made up of nucleotides. And so these are the 4 like basic, I guess, components, building blocks of the rest of life. So let's get started by talking about the cell. So you'll see that all sorts of different components are included here in the cell from what we just talked about. This is a typical animal cell. Let's quickly go over each of the components of the animal cell, what we call the organelles. So first of all, you just have the cytoplasm, which is like all the fluid inside the cell. And you have these like organelles that are inside of the cell. The important ones are the nucleus, which contains the DNA, which you remember is the nucleic acid of the cell. And this DNA is like the heritable unit of the cell. It helps to do with reproducing, passing on your genes to the next generation, passing on your genes. And these genes essentially control how the cell functions. And so the DNA, so you can think of it as like the central processing unit of the cell. And so this nucleus is like the central command center. And you'll also see something inside called the nucleolus. This is producing a bunch of things called ribosomes. So ribosomes are these tiny little purple dots that you see around the cell. If the DNA is the central like command unit of the cell telling the cell what to do, how does the cell do things? The cell usually uses proteins to do things, and so the ribosomes will produce the protein. So the nucleus, through its DNA, essentially says, make a protein, and the ribosome will actually make the protein. And so the ribosomes are the protein synthesizing factories of the cell. And then the ribosomes, they can be either free in the cytosol, or they can be attached to something called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Look at how rough it is. The rough endoplasmic reticulum helps with protein synthesis. And you also have its cousin, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is exactly like the endoplasmic reticulum, but it doesn't have any ribosomes on it, so it's not rough, it's just very smooth. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum helps with the synthesis of lipids. So you remember lipids as one of the 4 types of basic macromolecules. So the rough ER, which is what we call the rough endoplasmic reticulum, helps produce proteins. And the smooth one helps produce lipids. And the difference in roughness is because of the ribosomes on the rough ER. You might have also heard of the mitochondria. It's very commonly named. Everyone says the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And so what it does is it produces ATP, and ATP is like the energy currency of the cell. So if you ever want to spend energy to do something, the form of currency you're using is ATP. You're spending ATP to make things happen. ATP is the source of energy for the cell, and mitochondria produce the cell's ATP. You have the Golgi apparatus. So remember we talked about the DNA tells the ribosomes which proteins to make. The ribosomes made the proteins, but now where do they go? What do they do? Some of the proteins will go to the Golgi apparatus, which a lot of people compare to the post office of the cell. So the Golgi apparatus will package these cells, modify them, prepare them to be moved somewhere else, and then it will secrete proteins outside of the cell or to different organelles a lot of the time. So you have the central command unit, the nucleus with its DNA, and then it tells the ribosomes, which are either floating in the cytoplasm or on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which proteins do we make? And then once they're done being made, the proteins can come to the Golgi apparatus and be sorted, packaged, shipped out to their final destinations. Final other organelles that we might want to talk about are, let's say the lysosome that has a lot of digestive enzymes, very acidic organelle. So sometimes like if your cell's gonna eat like some bacteria in certain types of cells, like certain macrophages, white blood cells will consume these bacteria, then merge them with lysosomes, which will break them down. And you have the centriole and centrosome, which help with a cell's DNA replication. And so you'll see a lot of components from the animal cell, and they're coming over to the plant cell now. So the plant cell, the animal cell is nice and round, and like the plant cell is pretty rectangular. The plant cell, what are the differences? Well, first of all, I know this is just a schematic diagram, but it's green. Yes, plant cells tend to be green. And so the cytoplasm you see exists here, the same things, right? You have the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes, you have the nucleus. Okay, and now we're gonna focus on the big differences. So first of all, you have this huge, what looks like a swimming pool in this diagram. This is the vacuole, the central vacuole. And it contains a lot of water that gives the cell most of its size. Like look how much of the size it occupies in the cell. And this helps the cell remain like very firm. This gives it a supply of water and lets it like expand. So you might notice like a wilted plant or like a kind of wilted plant and you water it and it's just more firm and turgid. In the future, that's because the water just entered the cell here and it's now inside this vacuole, making each of the cells firmer and bigger. You also have, you also have the chloroplasts. These are unique to these plant cells compared to the animal cells. And these chloroplasts help with photosynthesis. So they, you have light that strikes the cell. We can talk about this more. And then chloroplast helps make these carbohydrates. Remember that the four macromolecules, the carbohydrates are made in the chloroplast. And so plants help produce most of our food that we eat. And finally, we'll compare two types of cells, the prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells. So what we just talked about, the animal cells and plant cells, we call them eukaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells, and they're exactly what we talked about with all these different organelles. They're very complex, right? You have a lot of different things going on. And then the prokaryotic cell, this is more like bacteria. And some key differences you might want to know is in the eukaryotic cell, you saw that we have this like central nucleus, and it's a great organizing, it's a great place for organization for the DNA. All your DNA is inside of this nucleus. But in the bacteria, the nucleus, the DNA is just like kind of jumbled up in this thing called the nucleoid that's just floating inside of the cell. There's no nucleus at all. In fact, there are no real organelles either. And a lot of these prokaryotic cells, they also have a cell wall like the plants, and they tend to have like sometimes these flagella, which can be used for movement. Same thing for these cilia, these like little hairs. So flagella are like these long tails or rotors, and then cilia or you can be like little hairs, and then you have these pili, which are also kind of like, you can think of them as hairs. They can be used for like identification, sticking to things. And yeah, so notice the big difference is in the lack of organelles in the prokaryotic cell.